reporting live from my bed because I am not in the playoffs. Here are the Panthers Polar Power playoff predictions. All right, so from the first matchup, we have 1 versus 16. We have the Illinois Valley Tigers versus the Bangor Xenon. This one's a pretty good matchup. I personally like the fact that Tigers have both Max Fried and Mike Soroka available for all their home games in Atlanta for the stadium boost there. Xenon has some great platooning options with Butera, Valeka, and Riley on the bench, and Allen and Guzman in the starting lineup to go against righties. This is going to come down to the fact that Xenon runs with Kyle Snyder and does not have a ton of great starting pitching outside of Tony Gonsolin. So I'm taking the Tigers in 5. I'm mostly unsure if the Xenon bullpen can handle a 5-game series without getting tired, which may run them into a little bit of trouble, especially in Atlanta. Next, we have the 8-9 matchup. That is Dingoes versus the Nocos. Ironically, Nocos has the better record, but Dingoes gets the higher seed because they won their division. I think because of this, the Dingoes actually have a pretty solid advantage in this series. 7 of their 9 hitters are eligible to trigger the New York Stadium. They also have Matt Moore available for Game 4 should the game go back to Nashville in a pivotal Game 4, which will either clinch or continue the series to a Game 5 back to where the Dingoes are home, where they get the advantage. I like the Dingoes bullpen. I think it's set up better for playoffs. Liriano is actually the biggest liability when it comes to the Nocos pen because a lot of his cost is poured into his 3 innings pitch, which doesn't necessarily translate well into the playoffs. Because of all of these things, I like Dingoes in 4. I think it's going to be pretty competitive, but I think we're looking at a lot of 1 or 2 run games, but ultimately Dingoes coming out on top. Next up, we have the Kailua Kings. Hope I'm saying that right. Versus the California Kraken. 5 versus 12. Ripe for a 12-seed upset. I think this is one of the best matchups that we have. Both are very evenly matched up. California Kraken did an incredible job building around Snyder. He has Hader or Lugo coming out of the pen, so no matter which way the team is slanted, he can start one of them. They're going to go 2 innings, and then you can roll into options like Julio Urias or Matt Moore. Looking solid. Something that's pretty interesting is that the Kings have home field advantage in San Diego, and both teams have Fernando Tatis Jr. I'd say the biggest difference here is that Fernando Tatis Jr. on the Kings is backed up by Benintendi, I guess. Real Muto and Nevin are both better hitters than Benintendi, but they're both righties. So as it's looking right now, 3 of the 4 best hitters on the Kings are all right-handed, which is a great boost for whatever matchup the Kraken's trying to do. However, on the Kraken side, he's supporting his Fernando Tatis Jr. with Babe Ruth and Anthony Rizzo. A lot more power. If you throw a righty against them, you're facing 15 on base versus Ruth and 13 on base versus Rizzo. It's going to be hard to circumvent Tatis Jr. If you want to throw a lefty, then now you're facing Tatis. Because of this, I'm going Kraken in 5 for a few reasons I mentioned before, and additionally, I do like California Kraken's managerial experience in this situation. But wow, the Kings know how to win, which is why the series is going 5. All right, speaking of managers that just know how to win, we have Fusion versus Two Rose Titans in the 4 versus 13 matchup. I do love that the Titans have high heat Jake Arrieta available for both Game 1 and Game 4 if they need. I think that's going to be a huge playoff boost for them. However, the flip side is Fusion has Julio Urias available for those times as well, so they kind of offset. Something else that I think that'll come into play is that St. Louis is going to factor in pretty heavily against the Titans' lack of power. They do have Edwin Rios, which has plenty of pop, but the rest of the team doesn't provide a lot of big swing threats. Without the ability to move them around the base paths, it opens them up for St. Louis to double them up and for Fusion to draw cards. Because of this, I'm taking Fusion in 3. I think their offense is fantastic, and all the advantages that Two Bros Titans have had throughout the season, I think Fusion just matches toe-to-toe with them really well. For example, you take their top hitters. Fusion has Ruth, Titans has Soto. Fusion has Dante Bichette, Titans has Miles Straw. They both have Edwin Rios, which is pretty good. Then Fusion has Ketel Marte and Phil Nevin. Titans have Luis Arias and Anthony Munoz, which isn't nearly as comparable. It's just a very bad matchup for the Titans. I'd love to see them steal this. Love to see them squeak out a couple games, but I think the Fusion just matches up too well against them. Next, we have the 3 versus 16, which is the Mays versus the Robins. I think this is going to be a really fun series to watch, regardless of who wins. On the Mays side, you have hitters like Musial, Cobb, Dye, and Acuna, which is insane firepower just from 4 hitters. For the Robins, you have Sam Hilliard, Babe Ruth, Bo Bichette, Edwin Rios. You're going to see a lot of pop coming from both sides. I think it's going to be super fun. Expect a couple double-digit run games from both teams. I'm talking 11-10, 12-9. It's going to be a fun series. Ultimately, what I think it's going to come down to is the Robins rotation does not match up well with the Mays, especially because they're not running Kyle Snyder. When it comes to Boston, none of the Robins pitchers has positive clutch, which you factor that in with the 4 big hitters that I mentioned before about the Mays, and all of a sudden, it's getting a little shaky. I think there's the potential for Game 4 to be really bad in Toronto. You get enough tired relief pitching and that lineup for Mays. I don't necessarily think the Robins have enough firepower to keep it going. However, I can easily see the Robins offense taking over and stealing a couple games. What I don't think will happen is if they reach a Game 5, Mays is going to lose. I don't think that the Mays lose 2 games in Boston. I have the Mays in 4 games, but I think this is a fluctuating situation. I think that the Mays could win in 5, but I also think the Robins could win in 4. I don't think that the Robins are going to be able to take 2 in Boston, nor do I think they could necessarily steal the Game 4 in Toronto and then win in Boston. In order for them to win the series, I think they are going to have to steal one of the first 2 games in Boston, as well as their Game 2 game in Toronto. Next up, we have a very interesting matchup, 6 versus 11. We have the Long Island Strike Zone and the New York Dutchman. This is actually as even as a matchup as you can get. There's nothing coming from either team that suggests that they're going to blow the other out of the water. There's no major advantages either way. Because of that, I'm picking the Dutchman in 5 simply because I like their build in Milwaukee. I think their home field advantage is very strong in games 2 and 4, so it's going to be a little hard for them to drop it. And the strike zone doesn't necessarily do anything amazing in Oakland. Interestingly enough, they both have Manaea on their team, but Manaea has 0 defense, so he doesn't even factor into the stadium. So I think it'll be an interesting series to see. So the only reason I'm taking Dutchman is I think their build in Milwaukee is stronger than Strike Zone's build in Oakland. All right, we got another interesting one here. We have the Bethlehem Bombers, the division champion, the Tory, my division, which I happily lost. Kidding, not happy. Versus the Virginia Neptunes, who is actually a very strong team. I like their build a lot, whereas Bombers I don't necessarily love. Obviously, Babe Ruth is Babe Ruth. Any team with Babe Ruth has a chance to score runs. Bombers doesn't really have much of a home stadium. He didn't go with any traded players despite being in Buffalo, which I thought was interesting. However, the Bombers do have Julio Urias and Tony Gonsolin for those games in Los Angeles. Unfortunately, I'm unsure if either of them are going to the bullpen, as his starting pitcher to the bullpen has not been reported yet. I think overall, Neptunes do have the better team. I'm taking Neptunes in 4. I think the Bombers are good enough to hold one in Buffalo, but I think overall the Neptunes are just going to steamroll them. All right, and our last matchup is the 2 versus 15, the Portsmouth Tugboats versus Queens Redbirds. This is another one where there's not a whole lot separating the 2 teams. I think this is going to come down to how much the Tugboats can trigger Toronto and draw cards, which will ultimately be too overwhelming for the Redbirds to overcome. For our first second round matchup, we have the number 1 seeded Illinois Valley Tigers going up against the 8 seed St. Louis Dingoes. And I like the Dingoes a lot in this series. I think first and foremost, you're taking a newer manager in the Tigers going up against one of the most experienced in the St. Louis Dingoes. And when it comes to playoff and managing playoffs and inserting certain strats, I do think the Dingoes have the advantage there. I do think that the Dingoes pitching staff fits really well in Atlanta, which kind of negates the home fieldness that the Tigers have. Tigers do have the deeper lineup by far, but I don't think it's deep enough to completely usurp the Dingoes' offense or offset the pitching advantage that they're actually getting from Atlanta with a lot of clutch guys like Taylor Rogers and Sergio Romo. So I'm actually taking the Dingoes in 4 games. Next, we have the 4-seeded Fed-Wheezy Fusion going up against the 12 California Kraken. This one's actually going to be really back and forth. 2 really good managers, 2 very analytical managers going back and forth. Their lineups are pretty equal. On the Kraken side, we have Babe Ruth, Ketel Marte, Brian Reynolds, and FTJ. On the Fusion side, we have Babe Ruth, Ketel Marte, Dante Bichette, Phil Nevin, Edwin Rios. So I think we're going to see a good amount of offense. I'm going with Fusion in 5. I do think that the low inning starting pitching lends itself better to a playoff format where you're not necessarily worried about bullpen tiredness as frequently. I think because of that, Fusion is going to be able to just basically get more outs. I don't see this series going less than 5 unless some dice rolls just skew it one way or the other extremely. I think this is a really fun matchup. All right, next up we have the number 3 Indiana Mays versus the number 11 New York Dutchmen. And I hate to say it, but this is probably as bad as a matchup as you're going to see. Mostly because the Mays have Mule, Cobb, and Acuna, which are all fantastic options in Milwaukee. That offense is going to be churning in the away games. And then the Boston advantage that the Mays has with Kyle Snyder is just, it's too strong. I have Mays in 3 here. I would be pretty surprised if it went 4 and be very shocked if it went 5. And our last matchup of the second round, we have the number 2 Portsmouth Tugboats going up against the Virginia Neptunes, the 10 seed. But I'm actually giving us to the Neptunes in 4. I do think that both builds are very strong for Toronto Stadium, but I do like the rotation edge and the bullpen depth of the Neptunes a little bit more than Tugboats. I don't think the Tugboats offense is bad. I just don't think it's that much better than the Neptunes that it's going to offset the pitching advantage that the Neptunes has across the board. All right, we got our championship series, and the first matchup is the St. Louis Dingoes versus the Fed-Wheezy Fusion in a matchup I'm calling the Ruling Rumble, as they are always rumbling over rules normally. For this one, I have one that's actually going to surprise a lot of people. I have Dingoes in 5. At this point, there's not a lot separating the teams. All 4 teams still left are very good teams, very good builds, and all great managers behind them. I do think that the Fusion's pitching structure, as mentioned before, fits playoffs a lot better. However, Dingoes does have a good pitching staff themselves. Ultimately, what it came down to for me is that I think that the Dingoes' home stadium of New York is going to give them a bigger boost than St. Louis will do for the Fusion. Therefore, kind of negating the fact that the Fusion will have an extra home game. I think these teams are just go toe-to-toe, and this is one that I think will go 5. You're going to see some great management, some great strategies, some great combos. Honestly, if this was our final, I would be stoked. I think it'd be a great matchup. But I think the actual final will be even better. And the second semifinal, we have the Indiana Mays going up against Virginia Neptunes. And I have Mays in 4 for the sheer fact that if the Mays are able to sweep the Dutchmen, they're going to have a fresh bullpen with a team that relies on a bullpen to start games and get them through a game. If they're not able to sweep the Dutchmen and therefore get that rest advantage going into the series, I could see it going 5 games. I think the Neptunes offense is strong enough to hang with the Mays through those dominant first 2 innings in Boston. But ultimately, I do think the Mays has an incredible offense to go along with their strong pitching and Boston advantage. And it is going to come down to the rest that they're able to get from a sweep or not getting a sweep in the previous series. Which brings us to our championship matchup. We have the St. Louis Dingoes versus Indiana Mays. Both people have been runner-up before. Someone's going to double down on that. Someone's going to get their first championship. And for me, I am taking, in 5 games, potentially 4, but we'll go with 5. I'm going with the Indiana Mays to win their first title. I think that bullpen rest with their Kyle Snyder and Boston combo is huge. I think the fact that they're going to have the home field advantage in the World Series is also huge. All in all, it comes down to the fact that the Mays has a team built for Boston. They've been able to execute in Boston incredibly well. They have the home field advantage so they get to play in Boston, and their offense translates really well onto the road. They do benefit from a well-played season by having an easier matchup than, I'd say, Dingoes, who has to face Tigers and Fusion and Nocos, or even Neptunes, who has to face, Bombers, Tugboats, or Redbirds. I think the way the bracket is set up, in addition to the way the teams are set up, I think this is the Mays' season to take it all home. So thanks, guys, for watching. Go ahead and leave a comment on what you think of these playoff predictions, whether you think there's going to be any upsets, whether you think I'm completely wrong with any of these picks. Regardless, don't forget to subscribe, and thanks for joining this special emergency playoff video of the OB Fun Club.